They say America is built on families, that beneath the farms, the houses, the photographs left in attics, lies a story of bloodlines, how they crossed, how they divided, and sometimes how they collapsed in on themselves. What I'm about to tell you is not the kind of history that makes it into classrooms or museums. It is the kind of truth families burned in silence, hid in basements, or buried in shallow graves. A man who carried a name, a husband who swore vows, and a secret that made even his own kin recoil in disgust. He was not just a father, not just a grandfather. He was the husband of his daughter's daughter, the most inbred husband alive. It begins the way most forgotten tragedies do, in a place where nobody was watching, a cabin on the edge of farmland, too far from town for neighbors to ask questions, a man already hardened by loneliness, already marked by whispers in the family line. He had no church to answer to, no sheriff watching, no laws that could reach the back roads where he lived. And in that silence he carved his own rules. The girl was born into a family already tangled by blood. Her mother was his child, and when that girl came of age, the man who should have been her grandfather became her husband. Imagine the silence of that house, the walls watching, the floorboards absorbing what could never be spoken aloud. A union that was not a union at all, but the echo of sickness passed down like an heirloom. Photographs from those years, if any survived, would not show the truth. They'd show a man in work clothes, a girl with a hollow smile, and a life that looked, on the surface, like any other. But under the skin, the lineage was folding over itself, generations collapsing, bones reshaping, minds breaking. He was building not a family, but a cycle, a curse carved into flesh. The people who lived near him didn't speak his name. They knew something wasn't right. They saw the girl, pale and withdrawn, and they saw him beside her, too close, too possessive. But in that era, shame was kept quiet. Better to turn away than admit what was happening in the dark corners of American soil, and so the truth grew like rot. This is where our story begins. But to understand how such a thing could happen, you have to go back further. The story of the most inbred husband alive did not begin with him. It began with the roots of his family tree, a tree so twisted and knotted that it no longer resembled the branches of life, but a noose of blood strangling itself. His parents were cousins, their parents had crossed lines before them. Generation by generation, the circle narrowed until choice itself was gone. He was born not of chance, but of inevitability. From the first breath, his body carried the marks of this cycle. His face was long, his jaw slightly uneven, his eyes never quite meeting. Neighbors remembered him as a boy who rarely smiled, a child with a strange silence, always watching, always apart. And yet in small towns, difference is endured as long as it keeps quiet. He was left to grow, to work the land, to live as though he were no different from anyone else. But the blood running in his veins told another story, one that was impossible to escape. By the time he became a man, his world had already shrunk to the boundaries of his family. Outsiders did not come close. He didn't court women in town, didn't build friendships beyond his kin. It was as though he was waiting, though no one could say for what. He lived by a code that wasn't written down, one that belonged to households where the walls never spoke and the doors never opened to strangers. His daughter was born into that silence, into that same bloodline that had no beginning and no end. She grew under his watch, knowing him not only as father, but as the only male figure in her world. When she grew old enough to bear children, she brought another girl into that cycle, his granddaughter, his daughter's daughter. And though that girl should have been shielded by every natural boundary of family, she became the one who would be taken. When people ask how such things are allowed, the answer lies in isolation. Families cut off from the world have no mirrors to see their own reflection. What is monstrous to us was, to them, routine. What was unthinkable to a town became unspoken within the walls of his house. He didn't simply choose to cross the line, he was raised in a world where there was no line left to cross. The marriage itself was not a ceremony. There were no rings, no witnesses, no vows spoken before God. It was something darker, quieter, sealed behind closed doors. He called her his wife, but she was not his wife. She was the child of his child, bound to him not by love, but by the weight of his will. Imagine the mind of that girl, raised in a house where silence was survival. She had been taught from birth that family was everything, that what happened inside those walls never left them. And so when he laid claim to her, she did not resist. She could not resist. She was not groomed for freedom. She was groomed for obedience. The neighbors began to notice strange things. They saw her wearing a scarf in the summer, as though hiding marks on her skin. They saw her walking a step behind him, her eyes never rising from the ground. And yet, when anyone asked, he would smile and say nothing was wrong. To challenge him was to invite a darkness no one wished to face. What happened within that house twisted her body as much as it twisted her spirit. Years of coupling between relatives had already left scars in her blood, and his claim upon her deepened the cycle. Her face carried signs of a lineage folding in on itself. The sharpness of her chin, the uneven curve of her skull, the shadow of deformities that could not be hidden forever. And when she bore children of her own, the circle closed even tighter. Some whispered about the children, how they didn't look right, how their eyes wandered in different directions, how they struggled to form words that other children learned with ease. But whispers remained whispers. No doctor came to the cabin, no teacher visited the house. The family was a closed system, feeding only on itself, breeding only with itself, until even time seemed to turn inward, folding the future into the past. He walked among them not as a husband, not as a father, not as a grandfather, but as all three at once. His shadow was in every corner of their lives, a figure who believed himself untouchable because no one dared to interfere. And in that silence, the most inbred husband alive lived as though his secret would never see the light. But secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks, even in the most tightly sealed houses. In time the neighbors could not ignore what they saw. The girl, his granddaughter, his so-called wife, looked more frail with each passing year. Her skin took on a grayness, her posture stooped before her youth was gone, and the children born of their union carried the truth written on their bodies. One boy's jaw never closed right, giving him a permanent grimace that looked like pain. A daughter's eyes never aligned, drifting apart no matter how she tried to focus. Another child limped when he walked, his legs uneven, his frame too weak for the chores demanded of him. These were not mysteries, they were the visible marks of blood that had circled too many times, of a family tree that was no longer branching outward but curling back upon itself. People in town began to whisper in sharper tones. They spoke of curses, of punishment, of sins that had come home to roost. But though they whispered, they still turned away. To name the truth would have been to bring it into daylight, and daylight demanded action. Better to keep it in the shadows, where responsibility could be avoided. The man himself grew harder with age. His face tightened, his words grew sharper, and his grip over the house only deepened. He had tasted power in its most perverse form, the power to rewrite the roles of father, grandfather, husband, and he would not release it easily. When challenged, he would remind his family that without him they would have nothing, no roof, no food, no place in the world, and so, out of fear, they stayed silent. But silence does not erase the truth. It only delays it. As the years dragged on, the children's deformities became undeniable, their presence a living testimony to what had been done in secret. Each face was an accusation, each crooked smile a reminder of choices that could never be undone. And yet, no law came knocking, no preacher stormed the house, no doctor intervened. The family continued generation upon generation, trapped in a loop of their own blood, while the man at the center of it all walked the earth as though he were untouchable. The line between father and husband, grandfather and master, had dissolved entirely. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what comes next is not just disturbing, it's the kind of truth that leaves a stain on the soul. You see, when a bloodline collapses in on itself, it doesn't only mark the body, it poisons the mind. The children grew, but they did not grow free. Their thoughts were stunted, their speech fractured. Some of them could not tell the difference between father, brother, or uncle, because in that house, those roles were all the same man. Imagine trying to understand the world when your family tree is nothing but a circle, when the man who disciplines you, who feeds you, who commands you, is also the man who lies in your mother's bed and in your grandmother's before her. The psychological toll was unbearable. One son grew violent, his anger uncontrollable, as if rage itself was his only language. A daughter retreated into silence, staring for hours at the same corner of the wall, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around her. The children were not simply cursed by genetics. They were prisoners of a family system that devoured its own future. And what of the wife, the daughter's daughter, trapped in the role of spouse to her own grandfather? Her body bore children, but her spirit withered. She spoke less and less to outsiders, her voice reduced to murmurs, her once bright eyes dulled into something that looked like resignation. There are those who believe she tried to escape more than once, but where could she go? Who would believe the story of a woman married to her mother's father? The town turned its face away. Ministers muttered about private sins. Sheriffs claimed there was no evidence worth pursuing. Neighbors convinced themselves it was better not to know. In that silence, the house became a world of its own, cut off, unchallenged, festering. And so the cycle ground on. Every year that passed, another sea. Hild was born into the loop, another life twisted before it could begin. The most inbred husband alive had created more than just a scandal. He had created a bloodline that was unraveling in real time, each generation more broken than the last. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have spoken, even if no one listened? There comes a point when silence can no longer contain what has been done, and for this family, that point arrived slowly, like a rot that finally broke through the surface of the wood. Outsiders began to speak more openly, no longer satisfied with whispers. The children, grown into misshapen adults, became visible proof that something unspeakable had taken root in that house. But exposure did not come through justice. It came through tragedy. One of the children, barely more than a teenager, collapsed in a field, his body too frail, too warped to withstand the labor demanded of him. When the town physician was called, he saw what others had chosen to ignore. The boy's frame was twisted by more than accident. His features carried the undeniable weight of inbreeding, and when the doctor asked questions, the answers chilled him. The boy's grandfather, his supposed patriarch, was also his stepfather. The lines were blurred beyond repair. News spread, though not in newspapers. It traveled in hushed voices at church, in wary glances exchanged over fences, in the discomfort of a town realizing what it had allowed to grow in its own backyard. The man became something more than just a neighbor. He became a specter, the figure parents warned their children to avoid, the name spoken with fear and disgust. And yet, still, no authority acted. The law hesitated, claiming the lines were too tangled, the testimony too fragile. And so the family continued, cloaked in shame, while the man at the center of it all grew older, meaner, more defiant. He believed himself untouchable, and in many ways he was. The silence of others had become his shield. But the toll was undeniable. His so-called wife grew ill, her body weakened by years of childbirth and the weight of a life lived under control. Her face sagged with exhaustion far beyond her years. She had once been a daughter, then a granddaughter, then a wife, all without leaving the same bloodline. Her existence was proof of a system gone mad, a family devouring itself in a cycle that seemed endless. This was not just a story of one man. It was the story of how communities look away, how shame becomes a weapon, and how silence can kill more effectively than any blade. The most inbred husband alive was not just a figure of horror. He was a mirror, reflecting the cowardice of everyone who chose not to speak. The man did not die in chains. He did not face a trial, nor did he ever confess. He lived out his final years on the same soil that had hidden his sins, surrounded by the broken lives he had created. His end was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost ordinary, and perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, that a man who married his daughter's daughter, who fathered children from his own bloodline until it crumbled, could be laid into the earth like any other neighbor, any other farmer, any other forgotten soul. But his story did not end with his death. The children remained, living testaments to what happens when blood is twisted into a knot too tight to untangle. Some drifted into obscurity, their names erased, their bodies hunched and frail, struggling in silence. Others carried the legacy outward, mingling with the wider world, but never fully escaping the shadow of their origin. The line did not vanish. It seeped into the soil of America like a stain that cannot be scrubbed away. And so we are left with the question, how many others were there? How many cabins on the outskirts of towns held families too ashamed to speak, too fearful to break the cycle? How many husbands were also fathers? How many grandfathers also husbands? History does not tell us because history does not want to know. What survives are fragments, whispers, rumors, the occasional photograph of a face that seems too distorted to be chance. The most inbred husband alive was not just a man. He was a symbol of what happens when isolation and silence are allowed to fester unchecked. His life is a warning buried in the archives of forgotten America, a reminder that what grows in darkness does not stay hidden forever. It shows itself in the body, in the mind, in the generations left behind. As you listen to this, perhaps you feel a chill, not just for him, but for the idea that stories like his are not as rare as we'd like to believe. They are out there, in the dusty corners of family history, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for someone to speak them aloud. And that is why his story matters, not because of who he was, but because of what he reveals. That the past is never really gone. It waits, patient and silent, for eyes brave enough to see.